All right. Well, good morning. How's everyone this morning? Doing well. I just wanted to start by thanking everybody. I've gotten really good feedback from the class. I've had about 5 or 6 people tell me that they're really hearing what I've said, and they tried putting salt in their coffee. So I'm glad some people are listening and taking something away from the class. So thank you all for that. At the end of last class, I mentioned that today's class was going to be based out of Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29. Now, I don't know if anybody went and looked and read that. That may seem like a kind of an odd reference to base an entire class upon, but that's where we're going to start. We're going to be kind of hopping all over the place today, but we're going to be talking about authority today and Jesus' authority. So I want to go ahead and start by reading that verse real quick. So in Matthew chapter 7, verses 28, it says, "When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law." So keep in mind, this is at the end of chapter 7. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 is the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus has just given his Sermon on the Mount, and this is the reaction from the crowd. And I've always been drawn to this verse because you have the greatest sermon that's ever been given, and this is more or less the limited reaction that we get about what the crowd thought about it. Wouldn't it have been kind of cool to have like a field reporter there, like interviewing people as they left and been like, "Hey, so what'd you think?" To get more of a reaction. This is the only reaction we get. There are entire online internet industries that people make a lot of money just reacting to things. I would have loved a little bit more reaction to this, but maybe we'll get those answers one day. But it says they were amazed by his teaching, and why were they amazed? Because he taught as one who had authority. Now, Jesus amazed, pretty much everybody he came into contact with. We have a lot of references to him teaching in the synagogues, teaching in homes, and the crowds being amazed. But here in particular, after the Sermon on the Mount, they were amazed because he taught as one who had authority. And unlike the teachers of the law, which simply interpreted the law. And if you go through the Sermon on the Mount and you listen to the way Jesus phrases things, it's always kind of interesting the way he speaks with such authority, with such strength. "I say to you, I tell you, take heed, do not, you shall not." Very definitive, very strong, very authoritative language. But keep in mind, a verse like this is not necessarily Matthew's commentary about the authority that Jesus had. This is the reaction from the crowd. So I think a question we have to ask is it possible to speak as if you have authority but not actually have the authority to do so? And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And this is one of those classes where we all know the answer, but I want to go through some of the reasoning to get to that answer. So let's talk a little bit about authority, just in general. So authority defined. If you go to the Webster's Dictionary and you look up authority, this is what it will tell you. It says, authority is the power to influence or command thought, opinion, or behavior. Seems to cover kind of the whole gambit, right? It's this idea of having the power to change people's minds, to influence the way they think, to influence their opinions, influence the things that they do, the way they behave. Seems to cover it, right? Let's look at a different dictionary. The Oxford Dictionary says, the power or right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. I want to linger on that last part there for a minute. Enforce obedience, because we're going to come back to that. But if you look at both of these definitions here, the kind of central theme between both of them is having some element of power that you have the ability to use. Now, is there a difference between power and authority? If you were to Google this, Google will probably tell you that power typically refers to the ability or the potential for an individual to influence thought, opinion, or behavior, while authority is the right to do so. You have a right to do something. So you don't necessarily have to have authority to exercise power, right? People exercise power all the time and don't have the right to do so. But in order to have authority, you have to have the ability to exercise some element of power. Now, where does authority come from? Authority can come from a lot of different places. Authority can be given Right? In my world, some of you in here probably have a power of attorney, right? That's you giving power to somebody else for something. As we're going to see later on in our class, Jesus had authority and he gave certain authority. He delegated authority to his apostles. So it can be given. Can authority be taken? Can I take authority? To some degree. You can take power, right? You read through some of the dictators of the world. Hitler, nobody gave him power. He took it. He took it for himself. It can be earned. I can do something to the extent where I've earned a certain element of authority. So here's a question I want to think about. Do you have to have authority for people to believe that you have authority? Can you fake authority? I'll put it that way. I have an example I want to go through. So a couple years ago, I was watching YouTube or something, and there was a video that popped up that's always kind of stuck out in my mind. And this guy, he has a YouTube channel, and I couldn't even tell you his name, but he was his goal of this video is he wanted to get into the Staples Center. That's where the Los Angeles Lakers play basketball. He wanted to sneak into the Staples Center and shoot around on the court without getting caught. That was his goal. That was the basis of the video. And this is a picture of this guy. And he wanted to sneak into the Staples Center to shoot some hoops. And he started throwing around different ideas of how he was going to do it, all these different options. And he came up with the idea was he was going to pretend to be one of the players and try to see if he could sneak past security. So he dressed up like this guy. This guy's name is Austin Reeves. He plays for the Lakers. And so he kind of got his hair cut to look the similar way. He found out the car that Austin Reeves drove and rented that car. I think it was like a Range Rover, and rented it and had his buddy drive him into the stadium, wore glasses, kept his hood down. He got past the parking lot security checkpoint because he said, I'm Reeves, I'm here for practice. They let him in. He got to the security where they have metal detectors. They let him in. He got to the court, was shooting around, and he's got his friend with him. He's videoing the whole thing, and he's thinking, like, how in the world did this happen? How did I get in this place? I can't believe that actually worked. And eventually, like 10 minutes later, security caught on to what was going on, and they escorted him out of the building. But I think a couple interesting points come up from this is, did the security guards at the Staples Center, did they see him as somebody who had the right to be there? They did. Right? They thought he was somebody else, so they let him in. Did he have the authority to be there? No, he did not. Did he have the right to be there? He certainly did not. Did he have the power to be there? Well, to some degree he did, because he got in, right? That's some power, a little bit of power. And to some degree, power is a little bit in the eye of the beholder, right? You can give me a lot more power than I actually have if you believe that I have that power or some level of authority. You hear people sometimes say we give power to the things that we're afraid of. You've probably heard that before. It's this idea that if I'm afraid of something, I'm giving it power that it may or may not have. I can have power so long as people perceive that power gives me a certain level of authority. So in this example, he had power, limited power, for a very short amount of time, but it wasn't sustainable. It didn't last. And so when we think of Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount, it said that the people saw him as somebody who had power. Did he have the power, or did they just think that he sounded like somebody who had the power? So the question comes, how can you tell whether or not somebody has power that is legitimate or sustainable? And obviously we all know that Jesus has that authority. He has that sustainability. But how do you tell? What's the measuring stick that we use? So for my next example, we're going to go to law school for a minute. This is a case that I studied when I was in law school. In Property 1, Professor Festa's class. And it's always stuck out in my mind. It's a really interesting fact pattern. So I'm going to give you all the facts, and I'm going to take a show of hands to see how you should determine it. So you all will be members of the Supreme Court for a minute. But here are the facts, and it's an old case, so bear with me. In 1775, a guy by the name of Thomas Johnson purchased land in Virginia from members of the Piankeshaw Indians. Now, you'll notice 1775 is 1 year away from something rather important. So this is before the formation of the country in its formal sense. So we're still under the rule of the King of England. It's under the rule of the colonies. And pursuant to a proclamation from the King of England in 1763, if you were living in the colonies, you had some level of authority to purchase land from the Native Americans. And that was under the decree from the King of England. Now, Mr. Johnson, some of you, if you're history buffs, you may know this guy. He's a kind of a well-known, semi-well-known figure. He was a delegate to the First Continental Congress. He was the first elected governor of Maryland. And he would later go on to be appointed to the Supreme Court by George Washington. So no slouch, right? He knew what he was doing. But then later on, he died, and he passed his property that he had purchased on to his children. Okay, so that's fact number one. Fact number two, about 40 years after the initial purchase of the land, you have a guy by the name of William McIntosh, and he goes and he purchases 11,000 acres directly from the U.S. government. So we have this newfound country, and if all of you, you all familiar with the Harrison Land Act, I'm assuming, right? But at that point in time, there was an incentive to try to get people to come to America, and so they were offering land for incredibly cheap, $2 an acre, come to America and you can buy land from the government. That's about $50 an acre today. That's a pretty good deal. But Mr. McIntosh was a fur trader, and he wanted to take up that opportunity, so he purchased these 11,000 acres from the U.S. government. Now, here's the issue. The issue that we have is that the land that Mr. McIntosh purchased from the U.S. government was the same exact plot of land that Mr. Johnson had purchased from the Piankashaw Indians. And at this point in time, Mr. Johnson had passed away, so his children, who were the heirs, they assumed the land, sued Mr. McIntosh in federal court. So that's the facts. So you're the judge, you're looking at these facts. Who does the land belong to? Does it belong to Mr. Johnson and his family, who purchased it in 1775 from the Piankashaw Indians, or Mr. McIntosh? So who would throw their vote for Mr. Johnson and his family?
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Very limited facts here.
Did the Piankashaw Indians own it in the first place?
That's a really good question. Let's, for the sake of our hypothetical, we don't know the answer to that. We don't know the answer to that. Do you have something?
No, the question you asked was who had authority to purchase the land? I would say the U.S. government.
So my first show of hands was for Mr. Johnson and his family. Who would throw their support behind Mr. McIntosh's claim? Okay, probably, I think more people are voting for Mr. Johnson and his family. Let me ask the question in a different way. Let's rephrase the question, because this is going to hinge on how this case becomes determined. Who had the greater authority to sell the land? Kind of going back to your question. Who had the greater authority to sell the land? The Piankashaw Indians or the U.S. government? In a unanimous decision, and this was all the way to the Supreme Court, by the way, the unanimous decision, the court held that Mr. McIntosh's claim was superior to Johnson's. Chief Justice John Marshall established that the federal government and the federal government alone had the sole right to negotiate property purchases with the Native American nations. The Indians themselves did not have the right to sell property to individuals. McIntosh's claim, which was derived from Congress, was superior to Mr. Johnson's claim, which was derived from the non-existent right of the Native Americans. Now, both of these transactions were backed by certain authority, right? So the sale, when Mr. Johnson purchased the property from the Piankashaw Indians, that had some authority. He had it for 40 years. His family had it for 40 years, uninterrupted, no issue whatsoever. It wasn't until Mr. McIntosh came along and purchased it from the U.S. government, which had a greater authority. Now, this is one of those cases, and I can remember studying it for the first time, that a lot of people get bent out of shape about. And there's reason for that. I mean, this is not a case, this is not a test study of fairness. Okay? This is not a determination of what is fair. This is a determination of who had the proper authority. But the principle from this case, which is still precedent today for property purchases, but I think demonstrates an undeniable truth regardless of the context of what you're talking about when it comes to authority. And that is that one's authority is solely dependent upon and only as legitimate as your ability to enforce that authority. in our example, the Native American nations, they sold the land to Mr. Johnson. They were gone. They weren't enforcing any of that authority, but the U.S. government was. So they had the greater authority. And again, one of the key words here is ability. Okay, it doesn't say that you do enforce that authority. It says you have the ability to enforce that authority. It's the same if I were to come over to your house this afternoon and you let me in because I'm such a nice guy, and I sit down on your couch, I get really comfortable, and I say, you know what? This is my house now. I'm going to keep it. Thank you. And you would obviously say, obviously, this is not your house. This is my house, so you need to leave. And I'm going to say, no, I think I'm going to stay. So what are you going to do? You're probably going to call the police, right? Police is going to show up and talk to you first, and they're going to say, so what seems to be the problem here? That's what they always say, right? What seems to be the problem here? And you're going to say, well, this is my house, and this moron won't leave. And they're going to look at me, and I'm going to say, this is my house, and this moron won't leave. And they're going to say, well, how can you prove this is your house? And you're going to pull out your documents, your title, or your deed, or your tax documents, and you have all this proof it's your house. And then I'm not going to have anything because I don't have any backing evidence to support my claim. And so they're probably going to handcuff me, take me out for trespassing. Why is that? Is it because it's just the right thing to do? No, it's because we live in a country that enforces its authority. And its authority tells you that you have the ability, because of the laws of this country, to purchase land and own it without interruption. And so that level of authority you own in your house is not because of anything you did, it's because the government says that you're allowed to do that. So now that we've gotten into the weeds on what authority is, let's get back to the text. So where does Jesus' authority come from? And I think it comes from a lot of different places. So for one, Jesus has authority by virtue of being the creator. All things were made by him and for him, specifically Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. It's a pretty good level of authority, right? He has authority by virtue of being the heir, which was prophesied in the Old Testament. That there's a reference to Psalm chapter 2 there. And also Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2 says, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of what? All things. And through whom also he made the universe. Pretty good level of authority. He has the right and authority by virtue of being the Redeemer. Jesus redeemed us from our sins. He purchased us with his blood. And that's always a concept that growing up, we always say it. He purchased us with his blood. But what does that even mean? Let me throw it or put it a different way. When you go to the store and you buy something, I go to the store and buy this bottle of water. Do I have some ownership of this bottle of water? Yeah, I bought it. I purchased it. Does that give me authority over this bottle of water? Sure, because again, I purchased it. I bought it. Jesus bought us with his blood. That gives him a significant amount of authority. He purchased us with his blood, and he gets authority from that. But to what extent? We talked earlier about this idea of having authority and whether or not it's sustainable. Is it lasting? Is Jesus' authority sustainable? Is it lasting? To what extent does his authority go? And we know from Matthew chapter 28, verse 18, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So how much authority has been given to him? All of it. That's a lot of authority. All of it. You try to think, kind of rationalize in your brain what that means. I don't think we can really rationalize what that means. Every ounce of authority there is belongs to him. And again, it was given to him by God. We know from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 22, that he has authority, received authority when he ascended to God's right hand. Verse 22, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand, that's Jesus, with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. I mean, we also know that he's the ruler of the kings of the earth from Revelation chapter 1, verse 4. It says, grace and peace to you from him who is, who was, and who is to come, and from the seven spirits before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, who is faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. How much authority does he have? All the authority, every ounce of it. And we also know that he is the head of the church, right? The church is the body, we're the body, he's the head, and there's significant authority there as well. But that doesn't mean that people questioned his authority. So we talked about when he would teach and he would speak that a lot of people were amazed, but some people were not necessarily amazed. They questioned it. So if you want to flip your Bibles over to Matthew chapter 21 for a moment, we're going to go into one of these examples. And in chapter 21, verse 23, it says, Jesus entered the temple courts, and I'll put it up here for convenience. He entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him. By what authority are you doing these things? They asked. Who gave you this authority? Jesus replied, I will also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or human origin? They discussed it among themselves and said, well, if we say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him? If we say of human origin, we are afraid of the people, for they hold John was a prophet. So they answered, we don't know. Then he said, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. So he's teaching in the temple. He gets questioned about his authority of what he's been doing and teaching, and he immediately sees through their hypocrisy, their behind-the-scenes maneuvering to try to trip him up. And since they would not give him an honest answer, he refuses to answer their question, which, by the way, when we talked last week in Matthew chapter 7 about the idea of not giving what is sacred to dogs, not throwing your pearls to pigs, I see this as an example of Jesus putting that into practice. He recognized that they didn't have the capacity to recognize the value that he was about to give them, so he didn't give it to them. But in retrospect, we can look at the story, and I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from this. And especially when it comes to matters of religion and religious authority. And he's basically telling us that you can get authority from two places. You can get it from heaven, or you can get it from man. And so if authority is going to come from heaven, it's got to come from either Jesus. Remember, we talked in Matthew 28. How much authority does he have? All of it. Or through his apostles, which he delegated certain authority to. We know from John chapter 13, that it says, very truly I tell you, whoever accepts anyone I sends accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. We know from 2 Corinthians that the apostles served as his official ambassadors. And we also have several references to the fact that the Holy Spirit was given to the apostles to guide them and lead them in all truth. And again, if you're familiar with 2 Timothy chapter 3, we have everything we need. There's no need for modern-day revelations. For in Scripture, we have all that we need to be thoroughly equipped for every good work. Everything we need, we already have. And that's authority that Jesus has given us and through his apostles as well. And that's why we can read through Paul's writings and have confidence that what he's telling us is authoritative, because that was delegated to him. But the problem we have is we often seek our authority from things that are not from heaven. We seek authority from things that were generated from man. And that can come from a lot of places. So for one, authority from man can be based on what the majority thinks. Now, how many modern-day religions were formed because a couple of guys got together in a room and held a vote? Is that how we come to determine what God wants of us? Absolutely not. Most people are sheep, if you think about it. If the majority is doing something, we all just kind of go with the flow. That's a dangerous place to be. And yet Jesus warned us about this in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 13, where he said, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So whenever we're basing our authority by what the majority thinks, we need to second guess that. Authority that comes from man is based upon what our parents taught us. Now, my parents are in here, and so I'm very thankful for all the things that they taught me. Yeah. But how many grown adults do you know that go to church, who claim to be Christian, and have a faith that is nothing their own, but is the faith that their parents passed down to them? And my prayer for my kids, my wife's prayer for my kids, is that my kids can grow up and grow into a faith that is their own. So not only that they do right, but that they want to do right. Not because they're trying to please me, but because they're trying to please the relationship that they have with their God. And that's incredibly important. I've known a lot of people who try to get their authority or set their standard for how they live their life based upon other people, right? I've heard a lot of people say, my grandma or my grandpa, that was the standard. That's where I need to be. If I can be as good as grandma or grandpa, then that's where I need to be. Is that appealing? Is that seeking your authority from God, or is that seeking your authority from grandma or grandpa? Seek your authority from the Lord. Authority comes from man when it's based on what the preacher tells us. Now, I threw this one in here because Sean's not here today, so we can talk bad about him. Now, fortunately, Sean does an incredible job of teaching from God's Word. But just because a preacher says something doesn't mean it's true. Some of you know my father-in-law, who's a longtime preacher. You may have heard of him. But something he has told his daughters, and then we've had conversations about, is if you ever hear me up there saying something, and you can open up your Bible and the Bible says something else, just completely disregard what I said. And I think that's true. We don't need to be sheep. We need to be conscious studiers of the Word so that we can have that personal relationship with God ourselves. Authority comes from man when it's based upon the traditions of men. Now, this kind of goes hand in hand with point number 1 up there, talking about the majority. But, I kind of get the feeling in Acts when the first church was formed that they didn't get together and said, hey, you know what? I bet 2,000 years from now there's going to be like 1,000 different variations of what we're doing here. I don't think that's what they were expecting. But when we base our authority upon the traditions of men, that's how denominations form. That's how they get their formation. And we have to avoid that and be careful of that. Authority from man comes when it's based upon what our conscience tells us. Let your conscience be your guide. We've heard that before. I don't know about you guys, but my conscience is not always that reliable. You may have heard the phrase, our conscience is like a clock. It works properly, but only if set correctly. How many of you have relied upon your conscience and your conscience isn't set correctly? We have to get our conscience set correctly by relying on those things that are from heaven, from Jesus, from the apostles' doctrine, and then it can be a good guide for us. Authority from man comes when it is based upon human wisdom. This is an issue for me to some degree, and I'll tell you why. Because many people think that through their own wisdom they can determine what is right and what is wrong. If it makes sense, I'm an analytical thinker kind of guy. If I can rationalize through something, then it makes sense to me. If it makes sense, then it must be true. If I can't make sense of it, then I won't accept it. But God's thoughts are not always our thoughts. We got to be mindful of that. Authority comes from man when it's based on our feelings. This probably hits a little bit, right? This is probably the number one struggle for most people. I would say by most of the world's standards, this is how we rationalize our authority. How does it make me feel? Do whatever feels right. So many people have a negative view of Christianity because there are elements in the Bible that just don't feel right to them. I mentioned a couple weeks ago, and this is always my go-to character, but the story of Uzzah. If you're familiar with that story, nothing about that story feels. It doesn't hit the feeling right. It feels unfair. But how do we determine righteousness? By what we feel or by what God does? That's one of those stories that is a demonstration of God's righteousness. And yet we look at it and we're like, oh, he got the raw end of the deal. It doesn't matter what we feel. It matters what God feels. The Bible talks a little bit about this in Proverbs chapter 14. It says, there is a way that appears right, but in the end it leads to death. Proverbs 28 verse 26 says, those who trust in themselves are fools. So we got to be mindful of that. We'll get to that in just a minute. So there's, it's interesting. We talked about what authority is, why Jesus had it, how he had it. And we had the story of him being in the temples and being confronted about where he got his authority. But a couple other references in the Bible of Jesus interacting with different things and them recognizing authority. We know that the angels recognized his authority. In Hebrews 1, when he came into the world, it mentions that. When he sat at the right hand of God, the angels worshiped him, recognizing his authority. But what's even more impressive than the angels recognizing his authority is that the demons recognized his authority. They acknowledged that he had the authority to destroy them. They obeyed his rebuke. There is, by my count, 12 instances in the Bible where Jesus cast out a demon. And I say 12. Some of the accounts are doubled up in some of the accounts, so my count is 12. And in 5 of those instances, Jesus actually talks to the demon. Wouldn't that be like an incredibly terrifying thing to witness? Jesus rebuking and the demon being terrified of him. Seeing the thing that you're scared of be scared of something else is always kind of an interesting scenario. I've been fortunate in my life. I've always had pretty good bosses, but I know some of you have probably had a boss that you probably despised, who was demeaning, who mistreated you, didn't talk very nice to you, and they're maybe in the middle of demeaning you, and then their boss walks in, and all of a sudden their tone changes. That's the picture in my head I get when this happens. The demons were terrorizing people, and then Jesus shows up, and they're just like in absolute terror of him. In Matthew chapter 8 and verse 29, Jesus is having an encounter with a demon, and the demon says, "What do you want with the Son of God?" They shouted. "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" That always stuck out in my mind. Have you come here to torture us? Does that sound like something Jesus just went around doing, torturing people, torturing demons? Doesn't really sound like Jesus, but that was their perspective of who Jesus was. That was their belief of what he could do. And this goes back to what we said earlier in the class. One's authority is solely dependent upon and only as legitimate as its ability to enforce that authority. Did the demons believe that Jesus had the ability to enforce that level of authority against them? Absolutely, and they were terrified of it. And so, I always kind of like to make things a little bit dour, I guess. But, when we talk about God, we always talk about God as love, he is forgiveness, he's compassion, he's mercy. All 100% true. But there's the side of this and the perspective that the demons had of him. They were absolutely terrified. We have to come before our God with fear because of the authority that he has. But it's also a great balance because of his ability to enforce that level of authority, but he actually does love us and he has compassion for us. But we must fear the Lord. All right, so let's go back to Matthew chapter 8. There's 2 references in Matthew chapter 8 where Jesus demonstrates some authority, and I want to end the class talking about those. So after the Sermon on the Mount, we see 2 really good examples. So in Matthew 8, starting in verse 5, and we don't necessarily need to read this whole story, but this is the story of Jesus encountering the centurion. And the centurion comes to him. In verse 6, he says, "Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." And Jesus says, "You want me to come out there and heal him?" And in verse 8, this is what the centurion says. He says, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, he goes. I say, come, he comes. I say, do this, and he does it." And this was a level of faith that Jesus was amazed by. And we lost our slide there, but it said he was amazed. Greater faith, no greater faith in all of Israel is what he said. But this story is interesting because you have a Roman centurion, not your I guess your expected character in this story. And a centurion would have been somebody, he would have been a commander of sorts, 100 or so soldiers underneath him. And so he was a military guy. And it's always interesting. I'm sure we have some military folks in here today. The military teaches a level of authority that I don't know if a lot of people really understand. I feel like people in the military get a sense of what authority is a lot better than the rest of us. Because without a respected line of authority, chaos would develop. It's impossible to have a large group of individuals trying to do a shared goal or a similar task without some level of chain of command being respected. You ever heard of the the tragedy of the commons. Anybody ever heard of what that is? It's this. It's like a economics theory or test of sorts, but it's essentially this idea that if you have a shared resource amongst a group of people, and if there's no leadership, there's no direction to how you are going to use that shared resources, that resource will become depleted, because people are going to do whatever they want for themselves. They're not going to be concerned about what the other people are doing. Think of you crash landing on an island with 10 other people, and you have a freshwater lake in the middle of the lake, and that's the only lake there is, only freshwater source. If nobody works together to try to figure out the best way to use that, everyone's just going to use it for their own devices, and you're going to ruin it. That's the idea. And soldiers are taught about working together and what it means to have authority. Delay on the battlefield can be disastrous. Speed can mean the difference between life and death, victory or defeat. Questioning authority, balking at commands, can easily result in your own death or the death of your fellow soldiers. So when you have a guy like a centurion in the story and he says, I am a man under authority, what I think he's really saying is, I know what authority looks like and you have it. You have it. And not only is he saying you have that authority, he's saying your authority is so great that all you have to do is say the word and it will be done. Just like I can say to my soldiers, go do this, and I don't even have to watch what they're doing because I know they're going to do it because they recognize my authority. I recognize your authority. Say the word and it will be done. So I think the question, the takeaway from a story like this that we have to ask ourselves is, am I a man under authority? Are you somebody under authority? And if you are a man under authority, or if I'm a man under authority, whose authority? Who am I seeking my authority from? Am I seeking my authority from the one who's been given all of the authority? Or am I seeking my authority from something lesser, something more convenient, something maybe I generated myself, maybe something that feels better? Where am I seeking my authority? Now flip over a couple verses down to verse 23 in Matthew chapter 8. And this is the story of when Jesus calmed the storm. And in verse 23 it said, Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came upon the lake, so the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. He replied, You of little faith, why are you so afraid? Then he got up, rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. So our theme of today, how much authority does Jesus have? All the authority. And I mentioned before that's a big, all is a big word. It's a very impactful word. And for something like this, that means he has authority over the winds and the waves. In verse 23, it says, He got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Now, I'm not much of a boat guy. To my wife's chagrin, she would love for me to be a boat guy. I'm not a boat guy. But I think the standard for boats just in general is the long-standing kind of unwritten rule of boats is you get onto the boat in order of your importance, typically speaking. Typically the captain will get on first, and then what do you say before you get on the boat? Permission to come aboard. So I find it humorous that there's a specific call out to the fact that he gets onto the boat and they followed him onto the boat because they recognized his authority in this. But following a full day of teaching, Jesus and his disciples, they get onto a boat to cross the Sea of Galilee. And suddenly a furious storm came upon the lake, so the waves swept over the boat. Now, I'm imagining that Peter forgot to check the Doppler again, Peter. So they didn't know the storm was coming. But I did read up a little bit on this, and the Sea of Galilee, the way it's positioned actually lends itself to pretty ferocious storms that can have some pretty drastic waves that would affect the boats. But Jesus was sleeping, and he's awakened when his disciples are fearing for their lives, and he scolds them for their lack of faith, saying, You of little faith. Jesus gets up, rebukes the wind, calms the seas, and they express their awe to one another, saying, What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. So this is a story we're all probably familiar with. You study this when you're a child growing up in Bible classes. The song "Master, the Tempest is Raging." That's where we get this song from. But I've always been kind of fascinated by this because, and I have a tendency of coming up with funny imagery in my head when I read stories like this. But the winds and the waves listened to Jesus. That kind of implies that they can hear. Think about that for a minute. The winds and the waves have the ability to hear. Now, do they have the ability to hear me? Of course not. They can hear Jesus, though. And I don't want the takeaway from today's class. Well, Joel said winds and waves have ears. That's not what I'm saying. But they have the ability to hear. But they can only hear God. So it's kind of a funny thought to think that when we're dealing with storms in our lives, how many times are we appealing to something for help that just cannot hear us? Whether it be a person, whether it be a government, whether it be a thing, we're calling out and it just does not have the ability to hear us, just like how the waves don't have the ability to hear me. When we need to be calling on God, who has the ability to hear us anywhere we are. But we are not exempt from storms. And I don't know if Shan is in here, but his class on Wednesdays, he's doing a phenomenal job going through the book of John. But he mentioned this in his class the other day, and he said something to the effect of, if we are going to be tested, we have to go through those storms. We are not exempt from storms. Jesus' disciples were not exempt from the storms. And I'm talking about both literal storms and figurative storms. Christians experience literal tornadoes, hurricanes. There are some really good brothers and sisters right now out in the North Carolina area who are dealing with the aftermath of a terrible hurricane. But as Christians, we face things like sickness. We face accidents. We face disappointments. We face death. Paul certainly faced some storms of his own, as we know. But Jesus never promised us exemption from the storms of this life. And a lot of that is because we are Christians. Not just that we're humans, we're Christians. We know we should expect those storms to come into our lives. And that's kind of a dour thought to think about, right? We can't just make those storms go away. We're not exempt from the storms. But the best news about the fact that we're not exempt from storms is that storms are not exempt from Jesus. When you look at the story, what woke Jesus up? The disciples woke him up. The storm didn't wake him up. I kind of think, if they just decided to leave him alone and never went to wake him up, would Jesus have just kept on sleeping? But the storm did not faze him. The storm did not bother him. The storm did not wake him up. It was the disciples that woke him up. And when the storms of life hit us and the waves are raging on all sides, how many times do we just kind of sit back and, I hope God comes and does something. Sure would be nice if he showed up right now. What do we need to do? He's literally in the other room. Go wake him up. If you're going through storms in your life right now, he's in the other room. Go wake him up. He's there. He's listening. He's there. He can hear you. He can help you. And I go back to the thought and the kind of the element that strings us all together. One's authority is solely dependent upon and only as legitimate as its ability to enforce that authority. How much authority did Jesus have? He had all of it. All of it, so much so to the extent that the winds and the waves can hear him. It's a wonderful thought. He can enforce his authority against people, against sickness, as with the centurion. When it comes to nature, he has the ability because all authority has been given to him. Now, I wanted to throw this song up here because I love this song. But this is Master, the Tempest is Raging. The winds and the waves shall obey thy will. Peace be still, peace be still. Whether the wrath of the storm-tossed sea, or demons, or men, or whatever it be, no water can swallow the ship where lies the master of ocean and earth and sky. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace be still, peace be still. And I'm going to throw this up here one more time, just so we all really hammer it in our brains. One's authority is solely dependent upon and only as legitimate as its ability to enforce that authority. Do we have the ability to enforce that authority? No, we do not. But God does. And that's today. Go enjoy your donuts. Thank you all.